Otero Valley, New Mexico, 1881. She stood in the middle of a red dust depot, one hand holding her sick mother, the other steady at her side. The most powerful man in the valley stepped forward, his voice flat and cold. "Leave the old woman behind, or don't expect a place here." Evelyn met his eyes. She didn't move an inch. "She is my mother. No man has the right to measure a human being by what they can produce." The crowd held its breath. He looked straight at the most powerful man in the valley, voice flat and final. "My home has room for both. Get in the wagon. Follow now. Don't miss a single chapter." The stagecoach rolled into Otero Valley like something half dead and still moving. Red dust rose up around the wheels in thick clouds, swirling against the late afternoon sun until the whole depot looked like it was burning. The heat pressed down hard on everything. The horses, the men leaning against the post office wall, the wooden sign above the depot door that read Socorro Station, the letters already fading from too many brutal summers. Evelyn Drake pressed her palm flat against the window frame and looked out. This was it then. She'd spent 4 days on that coach. 4 days of rattling bones and bad road, and her mother coughing into a handkerchief she kept folded tight so nobody would see the blood. Evelyn had memorized every crack in the leather seat. She'd watched the landscape change from green to brown to this red rock and open sky, and a silence so wide it had weight to it. She gathered her bag and stood up before the coach fully stopped. "Mama," she kept her voice gentle, "we're here." Genevieve Drake lifted her head from where it rested against the wall. At 58, she still had sharp eyes, gray and steady, the kind that had stared down Boston printing bosses and city councilmen without blinking, but the rest of her had worn thin. Her cheeks had hollowed out over the past year. Her hands, always so sure and skilled at the press, now trembled slightly when she reached for Evelyn's arm. "I'm fine," Genevieve said. She always said that. Evelyn said nothing. She just took her mother's hand and helped her down the coach steps, one at a time, out into the blazing New Mexico afternoon. The depot was crowded for a Wednesday. Ranch hands waited on a freight delivery. A few women stood near the general store across the road, watching. 3 men in good suits, too good for this heat, too stiff for honest work, stood near a stack of wooden crates being unloaded from a second wagon. One of them had a gold watch chain visible from 20 feet away. Evelyn noticed him the way you notice a thing that doesn't quite fit its surroundings. She set her bag down and kept one hand on her mother's back. Genevieve coughed a long, rattling pull of air that bent her forward. 2 of the ranch hands nearby glanced over. Evelyn didn't look at them. She rubbed slow circles between her mother's shoulder blades and waited for it to pass. It passed. It always passed. "We'll find the Mercer wagon," Evelyn said. Someone was supposed to miss Drake. The voice came from the man with the watch chain. He was taller up close. Mid-50s, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that had learned to arrange itself into something resembling pleasantness. Jonas Sterling. Evelyn had heard the name twice on the ride, in once from a traveling merchant who said it with respect, and once from an old woman near Albuquerque who said it the way you say the name of a disease. He looked at Evelyn with the mild, measuring expression of a man who priced things for a living. Then he looked at Genevieve. His expression didn't change exactly. It just cooled. "I heard Mercer was expecting a bride," Sterling said. He didn't offer his hand. Didn't hear. He was expecting a charity case along with her. Evelyn kept her voice level. "My mother is traveling with me." That's not unusual. It is when the man paying for the arrangement wasn't told. Sterling glanced at Genevieve again. The way you glance at livestock that's past its prime. "She's sick. Anyone can see that. A working ranch has no use for a woman who can't contribute, and no budget for a woman who'll drain its resources." The crowd near the depot had gone quiet in that specific way crowds do when they smell a confrontation and aren't sure yet which way it'll fall. Evelyn felt her mother's hand tighten on her arm. "Sir," Evelyn said, I don't believe you have any standing in the arrangements between myself and Mr. Mercer, sir. I have standing in everything in this valley, Sterling said pleasantly, including who settles here and under what terms. A sick woman is a burden. You'd do right by everyone, including yourself, to leave her in town. There's a boarding house on the East Road. It's not comfortable, but it'll do until... Until what? Evelyn said. Sterling paused. Until she passes? Evelyn kept her eyes on his. Her voice was steady, clear, and loud enough that every person at that depot heard every word. Is that the condition for my welcome here? That I leave my mother in a boarding house to die alone while I go build a life? Is that what this valley considers civilized behavior? A murmur moved through the onlookers. Sterling's pleasant expression flickered. You're being dramatic. I'm being exact, Evelyn said. My mother is a person, not an asset to be evaluated for productivity, not a line item in someone's ledger. She is 60 years old, she has spent her life in honest work, and she is entitled to dignity simply because she exists. No law in this territory and no custom, no matter how long it's held, can reduce a human being to their usefulness and call that justice. Someone near the post office made a low sound. Agreement, maybe. Sterling stepped closer. His voice dropped to something quieter and less pleasant. Be very careful, Miss Drake. This valley operates a certain way. You'd do well to understand that before you make enemies of people who can make your life considerably harder. Then I'll make enemies, Evelyn said. I've made them before. For a moment, nobody moved. Then a shadow fell across the space between them. It came from the left, from the gap between the depot building and the water trough, where the shade was darkest. A man stepped out of it slowly, without hurry, the way men move when they're completely unbothered by the tension around them. He was tall, wide through the chest and shoulders in a way that wasn't bulk, but used the body of a man who'd spent years doing hard things. He wore a worn canvas coat, despite the heat, and a hat pulled low over a face that was weathered and still, a jagged scar cut from his left cheekbone, down toward his jaw, pale against his sun-darkened skin. He didn't look at Sterling first. He looked at Evelyn, just for a moment briefly, his dark eyes calm and assessing. Then he walked past her and picked up her frayed leather bag from the ground without being asked. He held it easy, like it weighed nothing. Then he looked at Sterling. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for the rifle slung across his back. He just said it, flat and final, the way a man states a fact that isn't up for discussion. My home has room for both. Get in the wagon. Sterling stared at him. The man waited. Sterling's jaw shifted. He glanced at the small crowd, the ranch hands, the women across the road, the men near the crates who worked for him and were now carefully looking elsewhere. He smoothed the front of his coat and said nothing. He turned and walked away. The crowd exhaled. Evelyn watched him go, then turned to look at the man holding her bag. Gideon? Mercer. It had to be. She'd read his letters 6 times on the journey here. Sparse, honest words. No flowery promises. He'd said he needed someone capable, and she'd said she was. They'd agreed on a trial period with no obligations. He'd said he had room. He hadn't mentioned how quietly he could end a confrontation, or the way his presence seemed to change the temperature of the space around him. He was already moving toward the wagon, without looking to see if she'd follow. Evelyn turned to her mother. Genevieve's gray eyes were bright, not with fear, with interest. She watched Gideon's retreating back with the focused expression she used when she was considering whether a man might be worth believing in. Well, Genevieve said softly. Don't, Evelyn said. I haven't said anything. You were about to. Genevieve smiled and let Evelyn take her arm. They followed him to the wagon. The afternoon sun was sinking behind the red rock ridge to the west, and the light had gone golden and long, the kind that made everything look like the beginning of something. Evelyn climbed up and settled beside her mother on the bench. Gideon took the reins, clucked once to the horses, and they rolled out of the depot without ceremony. Nobody spoke for a while. The dust rose and settled. The valley opened up wide ahead of them, vast and quiet and ancient. Then Genevieve coughed once, short and sharp, and pulled her handkerchief from her pocket. Gideon didn't turn around. He didn't say anything pitying. He just reached under the bench with one hand, found a canteen, and passed it back without a word. Genevieve took it, drank, handed it to Evelyn. Evelyn held it for a moment. Then she looked at the back of Gideon Mercer's head, at the dust on his coat, and the scar she could see at the edge of his jaw, and she thought that whatever this was, whatever this man was, he had done something at that depot that very few people in her life had ever bothered to do. He had treated her mother like she mattered, not out of politeness, not out of performance. He had simply walked over, picked up a bag, and said, "My home has room," as if it were obvious, as if there were no other reasonable answer. Evelyn looked out at the wide red valley and said nothing. But something in her, something careful and long-guarded, listened to the rhythm of the wagon wheels and began, very slowly, to rest. Ironwood Ranch appeared around a bend in the road, like something that had grown out of the land rather than been built on it. The main house was adobe, low and thick-walled, with a wide covered porch running the full length of the front. Cottonwood trees stood on either side, old ones, their roots deep and their branches spread wide enough to throw real shade. Behind the house, a barn of weathered pine planks, a chicken coop, a stone water trough, and beyond all of it, open range that stretched toward a ridge of red rock turning purple in the failing light. Wasn't grand, but it was solid. Everything about it said permanent. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard, looking at it. Genevieve stood beside her, not coughing for once, just taking it in with those steady gray eyes. The front door opened before Gideon had finished tying off the horses. A man came out onto the porch, tall, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, with a ledger book tucked under one arm and a pencil behind his ear. He moved with the ease of someone completely at home in his own skin. He looked at Evelyn, then at Genevieve, then at the bags in Gideon's hands, and his expression settled into something warm and practical at the same time. "I put the back room in order this afternoon," he said to Gideon. "Figured you'd want fresh water in there." "Good." Gideon set the bags down on the porch steps. "Evelyn, this is Elias Quick. He runs this ranch better than I do, and he'll tell you that himself." Elias Quick extended his hand to Evelyn and shook it firmly, the way men shook hands with each other when they meant it. Then he turned to Genevieve and did the same thing, carefully aware of her frailty, without making a performance of it. "Ma'am," he said. "Welcome." Genevieve looked at his hand, then at his face, then smiled with genuine warmth. "Thank you." Evelyn had been watching. She'd noticed the handshake, the direct address, the complete absence of hesitation. In Boston, she'd known educated men lawyers, professors who wouldn't have done that. Men who would have found a way to look past Elias without quite looking at him and told themselves they were being polite. Gideon Mercer carried both bags inside, without any announcement. Elias held the door. Evelyn went in. The inside of the house was simple and clean. A main room with a stone fireplace, a heavy pine table with 4 chairs, shelves along one wall holding tools and tins, and a single row of books. A braided rug on the packed earth floor. 2 oil lamps, one lit, throwing gold light against the white adobe walls. It was spare, but it had been cared for. That was something. Gideon showed Evelyn and Genevieve to the back room, 2 narrow beds, a wash basin, a single window facing the cottonwoods. Then he left them to settle and went back to the barn without ceremony. Genevieve sat on the edge of one bed and pressed both palms flat against her knees. "He told that man to treat you with respect," she said. "He didn't have to say it," Evelyn said, unpacking her mother's things. "That's what I'm telling you." "I know," Genevieve said. "That's exactly what I mean." In the days that followed, the ranch established its rhythms, and Evelyn found her place in them by watching before she moved. She was up before sunrise. She helped with breakfast, learned where things were kept, learned that Gideon took his coffee black And Elias took his, with whatever was sweet and available. Learned that the horses had names, and that the names mattered to the men who used them. She also learned that Elias Quick ran the ranch's accounts with a precision that would have made the senior clerks at her father's old firm in Boston sit up and pay attention. She found him at the table. One evening, the ledger open, his finger moving under a column of numbers while he worked something out in his head. He arrived at the answer and wrote it down before she'd fully taken her seat across from him. "You've been doing this a long time," she said. "Since before the war," he said. "Gideon taught me figures when we were both soldiering. Numbers made sense to me, faster than most things did." Evelyn looked at the ledger. Neat columns, correct tallies, careful notes in the margins. All of it done by a man who had taught himself arithmetic by necessity, and refined it by practice. "Can you read the words?" she asked. Straightforward, no softness in it, to make it into something delicate. He'd appreciate that, she thought. Elias was quiet for a moment. "Not well. I can read enough to know what a contract says, more or less. Enough to know when someone's trying to fool me." He looked at her steadily. "Not enough to read a letter from start to finish without fighting it. Would you want to?" He considered that seriously. "Yes. Then I'd like to teach you," Evelyn said. "If you're willing." Elias looked at her for a long moment. Not with surprise, exactly. With the careful assessment of a man who had learned the difference between people who offered things and people who meant them. "All right," he said. They started the next morning. Evelyn began the way her own teachers had begun with her, not with long passages, but with the alphabet as sound rather than shape, and then with words that connected to things already known. Elias picked it up with the same focused precision he brought to his ledger. He asked questions when he needed to, and didn't when he didn't, and he never pretended to understand something he hadn't yet understood. After 3 days, Evelyn brought Genevieve in. Her mother had been resting more than she wanted to. She made no secret of resenting the limitation, but her hands were still skilled, and her mind was still sharp. And when Evelyn showed her what she was doing with Elias, Genevieve's eyes lit up in the way they always did when she saw a problem she could help solve. She'd brought her brass printing type from Boston. 6 sets of letters, each one small and precise, packed in a wooden case lined with cloth. She set them on the table and looked at Elias. "I'm going to show you something," she said. She arranged the letters slowly, one at a time, pressing each small brass piece into the compositing stick she carried in her kit. Her hands moved carefully, not trembling now, focused and purposeful in a way the rest of her couldn't always manage. When she was finished, she slid the case across the table to Elias. He looked at the letters arranged there. E-I-A-S. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he pressed the tips of 2 fingers against the first letter, gently, like it was something he didn't want to disturb. "I've seen my name written before," he said. "Someone else always wrote it. Now you know how to put it together yourself," Genevieve said. She pulled another set of type and set them in front of him. "Arrange it. Use the shapes you learned." Elias picked up the E. He placed it first, then the L. He slowed at the I, cross-checked it, placed it correctly, the A, the S. When he finished, he sat back and looked at his name, set by his own hands. Nobody said anything for a moment. Genevieve said, "Being illiterate doesn't mean a person lacks intelligence. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise. Society failed to give you access to reading. That's society's failure, not yours." Elias nodded slowly. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "There were men in this valley who'd use that against me, claim I couldn't understand what I signed. And now you're taking that excuse away from them," Evelyn said. Elias looked at the type again. Then something in his expression shifted, quiet and definite. The satisfaction of a man who has added something to himself that no one can remove. Intellectual freedom, Evelyn believed, was the one tool no one could repossess. A man could lose land, lose money, lose a decade to violence and injustice. But once a mind learned to read, learned to think on paper and parse the written tricks of the powerful, it changed the arrangement. It made certain lies harder to tell. She believed that down to her bones. Her mother had printed it on pamphlet after pamphlet in Boston, and Evelyn had grown up knowing it the way she knew her own name. Gideon appeared in the doorway from outside, hat in hand, taking in the scene at the table without comment. He looked at the brass type, at Alias, at Evelyn. He didn't say anything. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and went to pour himself coffee. But before he turned away, Evelyn caught his eyes for just a moment, and there was something in them, not surprise, not sentiment, just a clear and steady recognition. The look of a man who sees something done right and knows it. She looked away. She helped Elias set the next word. They came on a Thursday mid-morning, when the sun was already punishing, and the horses in the paddock were restless with heat. 4 men, riding in at a pace that was too relaxed to be friendly and too deliberate to be casual. Sterling's men, Evelyn, didn't know that yet, but Elias had straightened in the yard before they were halfway down the road, and that told her enough. Gideon was at the fence line, repairing section that the last storm had pushed out of true. He heard them before he saw them, turned once to look, then set down his tools with the calm, unhurried movement of a man deciding to let something come to him rather than going to meet it. Evelyn stayed on the porch. Genevieve was inside resting. Elias drifted to the edge of the yard with his arms loose at his sides. The 4 men pulled up 10 yards from the porch. The one in front had a square, flat face and a canvas duster, too heavy for the weather, which meant he was carrying something under it. "Mercer," the man said. "Mr. Sterling wants to talk terms on the water rights." "Mr. Sterling can come talk them himself," Gideon said. "He sent us to start the conversation." "Then the conversation starts with you getting off my property." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Now that's not very neighborly. You've got a new woman here, I see. New arrangements. Man in that position ought to think about stability, about what he's protecting." He let that sit for a moment. "The water rights are worth more than this ranch will ever make. Sterling's being generous." "He's being greedy," Gideon said, "and there's a difference." The man's smile dropped. He reached into his duster, and Gideon moved. Not fast exactly. Efficient. He closed the distance in 4 steps, caught the man's wrist before the gun cleared leather, turned it in a way that produced a sharp sound of pain without breaking anything, and had the pistol out of the man's hand and in his own before the other 3 riders had fully processed what was happening. He stepped back. He held the gun easy, barrel toward the ground. "Your horses are tired," he said. "The road back to town is long?" "I'd start now." 2 of the remaining 3 men exchanged a look. The man with the wrist was cradling it against his chest and breathing with effort. Nobody was drawing. The moment had passed, and Gideon had let it pass without anyone getting hurt. That was a choice. Evelyn understood that clearly. A man with his training, with his experience, had any number of other options available to him at that moment. He'd chosen the one that ended it, without permanent damage to anyone. The 4 men turned their horses and left. Elias picked up a shovel, leaning against the barn wall, and went back to what he'd been doing, just like that. Gideon ejected the rounds from the pistol, pocketed them, and set the empty gun on the fence post. He'd return it to town later. He went back to the fence line. Evelyn exhaled slowly and went inside to check on her mother. That evening, after supper, Gideon built up the fire in the main room because the night had gone cold faster than expected, the way nights did in the high desert once summer started to thin at its edges. Elias had retired to the bunkhouse. Genevieve had fallen asleep early. Evelyn sat at the table with a book she wasn't really reading. Gideon sat in the chair near the fire with a piece of leather he was mending. Neither of them spoke for a while. The fire popped. Wind came against the window and moved on. "I want to discuss the arrangement," Evelyn said. Gideon looked up. "The letter we exchanged established terms," she said. "But neither of us has spoken plainly about what we actually expect." "I think we should." He set the leather down. "All right. I came here in good faith," Evelyn said. "I believe you did too. But a mail order arrangement isn't a transaction I intend to honor if it means entering a marriage neither of us has chosen with full understanding. Gideon nodded once. I'm not asking to dissolve anything, she said. I'm asking that we proceed honestly, as two people who are genuinely getting to know one another, not as a contract being fulfilled. He was quiet for a moment. The fire moved. I didn't write that letter, looking for someone to keep house, he said finally. His voice was low and even. I can keep my own house. I wrote it because this valley is full of people making decisions about other people's lives, and I wanted someone beside me who understood why that's wrong. He paused. I thought that was what your letter said, too. It was, Evelyn said. Then we agree, Gideon said. Take whatever time you need. The room is yours and your mother's for as long as you need it. No obligation beyond that until you choose it, if you choose it. Evelyn looked at him across the firelight. There it was again, that straightforward decency he seemed to practice without announcing it. He didn't speak of choice as a gift he was granting her. He spoke of it as the obvious baseline. That's fair, she said. It's just true, he said. He picked the leather up again and went back to mending it. Evelyn turned a page in her book without reading it. Outside, the wind came back, and the cottonwoods knocked their branches together in the dark, and the fire in the ironwood hearth burned steadily without hurry. She thought about what he'd said. I wrote it because this valley is full of people making decisions about other people's lives. She thought about Sterling at the depot, looking at her mother like a cost-benefit problem. She thought about Elias setting his own name in brass type. She thought about the four men on horses that morning, and the way Gideon had taken the gun and the aggression out of the situation without taking any pleasure in it. She thought about the fact that everything she'd seen from this man in the short time she'd been here had been consistent. That was rarer than people admitted. Most men showed you what they wanted you to see. Gideon Mercer seemed to simply do what he thought was right and leave the interpretation to whoever was watching. She didn't know him yet. That was true. But she was beginning to understand what kind of man he was. She went to bed when the fire burned low, and for the first time since Boston, she slept without planning anything. The brick storage shed at the east edge of the property had been used, at various points in its life, to hold feed grain, broken equipment, and what appeared to be 3 years' worth of things nobody wanted to make a decision about. Evelyn stood in the doorway the morning after her second week at Ironwood Ranch and looked at all of it, with the expression of someone already rearranging things in her head. Gideon appeared behind her. He looked past her at the mess, then at her face. I'd like to use this room, she said. For what? A schoolhouse. He was quiet for a moment. Then there's a grain store in the main barn we can use instead. Less damp. That was all he said. No questions about whether it was practical. No suggestions that she might want to wait and see how things settled first. He walked away to start moving the grain, and she went to find a broom. By the end of that week, the shed had been swept, aired, and fitted with 2 long plank benches Elias built from scrap lumber. Evelyn found a piece of smooth pine board in the barn that could serve as a writing surface if mounted on the wall. She mounted it herself, with Elias, holding it level while she drove the nails. Genevieve, from the chair they'd brought out for her, supervised. It needs to be higher on the left, she said. It's level, Elias said. The left side will look low from the back of the room. Elias adjusted it 2 inches higher on the left. They stood back. It looked right. Thank you, Genevieve said, entirely without irony. Word traveled through the valley, the way words do in small places without any deliberate effort, and faster than anyone expected. By the second week after the shed was ready, 7 children showed up on a Tuesday morning. 3 were the sons and daughters of white homesteaders from the road north of the ranch. 2 were children of a Mexican family who ran a small spread 2 miles east. 1 was the son of a freedman who worked a claim up near the creek. 1 was a girl nobody had seen before, maybe 9 years old, who gave her name as Clara and offered no other information, and sat in the back row paying fierce attention to everything. Evelyn looked at them all sitting together on those plank benches and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not since Boston. Not since she'd stood in front of her last class before everything fell apart. She felt useful. She started with what she always started with, language. Not grammar rules written on a board, but words used aloud. Words connected to the world they all actually lived in. She asked them what they saw on the ride here. She asked them to say it in whatever language came first, and then they worked together to find the English. The boy from the Mexican family, his name was Rafael, knew the Spanish word for ridge, but not the English. A girl named Helen knew the English word, but when Evelyn asked her to describe what a ridge looked like without using that word, she couldn't do it. By the end of that first session, they could all describe a ridge in 3 different ways. Evelyn believed, and she said it out loud that day in the shed, that learning to describe something accurately was not a school exercise. It was the beginning of being able to argue for yourself. Being unable to say precisely what you mean was how powerful people kept less powerful people from being heard. Raphael looked at her carefully when she said that. My father signs papers he doesn't always understand, he said, because he doesn't want to look like he doesn't know. That's exactly what I mean, Evelyn said. And it's not his fault. It's the fault of anyone who would use that against him. She looked around the room, at the mix of faces, the mix of ages, the single bench where a white girl and a black boy were sharing a piece of chalk without either of them thinking about it. She kept teaching. Genevieve came most mornings. She didn't stand, but she didn't need to. She'd set up her small hand press on a table near the door, and she'd print short sheets a paragraph, sometimes 2 on literacy, on kindness, on the history of printing itself. She'd leave them on the benches at the end of each session for the children to take home. She wasn't well enough to work the press the way she once had, but she was well enough to do this. One afternoon, Evelyn found her mother reading one of the sheets aloud to Clara, the girl from the back row, who had confided by then that her family had no books and never had. Genevieve read slowly, following the line with her finger, stopping to let Clara try the next word herself. Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched and said nothing. That same week, Gideon began sleeping better. Evelyn noticed because she didn't sleep deeply herself, never had, and the walls of the adobe house were thick but not silent. In the first weeks she'd heard him, sometimes in the hours before dawn, a sharp sound, boots on the floor, the creak of the main room door opening and closing as he went outside. He never made a scene of it. He just went out, stayed a while, came back. She'd asked Elias once, carefully. The war, Elias had said. Nothing more. He didn't explain it as if it needed explaining, which itself told her everything. But that third week, with the schoolhouse full, and the press running, and the sound of children's voices carrying across the yard in the afternoon, something in the house changed. She couldn't quantify it. Gideon sat at supper without the particular stillness that had seemed before, less like calm and more like held breath. He listened to Elias, read a full sentence from his primer, without stopping more than once, and when Elias got it right on the second attempt, Gideon said, simply good, and meant it in a way that filled the room. Genevieve watched this from her end of the table. Later, when Evelyn came to help her to bed, her mother said, "This house is healing." "It's a good house," Evelyn said. "No." Genevieve looked at her. "The house was always good. I mean, the people in it are healing, including you." Evelyn straightened the blanket and didn't answer, but she thought about it after she'd blown out the lamp. She lay in the dark and listened to the cottonwoods and thought about the fact that she'd come here frightened, though she'd never have used that word for it. She'd come here practical and resolved and prepared, and all of those things were true. But underneath them, she'd been frightened of being wrong about this, of arriving somewhere new and finding that the decency she'd glimpsed in a letter was only a letter. It hadn't been only a letter. She didn't know what to do with that yet. so she filed it away. The way she filed things she wasn't ready to examine, and she went to sleep to the sound of a quiet house. In the morning, Gideon had coffee ready when she came out. He handed her a cup without fanfare and went back to looking out the window at the ranch in the early light. Raphael's father is having trouble with a land document, Evelyn said. Can anything be done? Gideon turned from the window. What kind of document? He's not sure. That's the problem. Gideon set his cup down. Tell him to bring it in. Elias can look at it. Elias couldn't read it 2 weeks ago. He can read more than he could 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, Gideon said. And I can read the rest. Evelyn looked at him. You didn't have to offer that, she said. No, he agreed. He picked his cup back up. But it's the right thing to do. She drank her coffee and let that be what it was. Nobody predicted the storm. That was the thing about early winter in the high desert. The sky could be wide and clear and indifferent at noon, and by 3 in the afternoon, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the clouds were moving in from the northwest like a verdict. Elias saw them first. He came in from the south paddock at a near run, which was unusual enough that Evelyn looked up from the schoolhouse, where she was stacking the day's lesson sheets. Storm coming hard, he said from the doorway. We need to get the animals in. He was already moving before he finished the sentence. The children had left an hour earlier. Evelyn secured the schoolhouse shutters, helped Genevieve inside from where she'd been sitting on the porch, and got her settled with a blanket and the lamp turned up before going back out. The wind had already changed. She could feel it, colder and purposeful, pushing from the northwest across the yard. Gideon was in the barn. She found him in the far stall, working fast, getting the horses settled. He looked up when she came in, and for half a second seemed surprised she was there rather than inside. I can do something useful, she said. He didn't argue. The roan needs to be moved to the back stall. She's nervous in weather. Evelyn moved the roan. They worked through the barn quickly, efficiently, without needing to talk much. Elias came through with the last of the cattle from the east paddock. The snow started before they'd finished first, as something that felt like cold sand, then as real snow, heavy and fast, the kind that meant business. They were nearly done when Elias appeared at the barn doors and said, one of the cows didn't come in, the one that was close to calving. Gideon straightened. Where? Tracks go toward the North Ridge. The North Ridge was a quarter-mile out, rough ground exposed. In a storm like this, in another hour, it would be genuinely dangerous to cross. Gideon was already reaching for the rope. He looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. I'm coming, she said. He didn't tell her not to. He got her the heavier coat from the wall hook, his own spare, too large but warm, and handed her one end of the rope. They went out into the storm. The snow came sideways by then, hard enough to sting any skin. Visibility was cutting down by the minute. Evelyn kept one hand on the rope looped between her and Gideon and watched her footing on the frozen ground. The North Ridge rose ahead of them, a dark line of rock and scrub pine barely visible through the white. She heard the cow before she saw her. A low, strained sound, not quite a bellow, not quite a moan coming from the hollow below the largest outcrop on the ridge's east face. They found her there, wedged tight against the rock, sides heaving, the newborn calf pressed against her flank. The calf was alive. Both of them were alive. But the cow had gotten herself into the hollow so far that she couldn't back out, and the calf was too young and too cold to move on its own. Gideon assessed it in about 4 seconds. He looped the heavy rope around the cow's middle, checked the calf's condition with one quick hand breathing. Cold but not critical, and handed Evelyn the other end of the rope. When I say pull, he said, pull toward me. Don't stop unless I say stop. All right, ready? Ready. He positioned himself at the cow's flank, got his shoulder against her, and said, pull. Evelyn pulled. The cow resisted, terrified and stuck. Gideon pushed. The snow drove against them both. Evelyn planted her feet and pulled with everything she had, the rope burning through her gloves. And for a long moment, nothing happened except the wind, and the effort, and the rope going taut. Then the cow shifted, and shifted again, and came free. She lurched forward, and Evelyn stumbled back a step but kept her feet. The calf scrambled up on legs that barely worked, pressed against its mother, and the cow immediately turned and began to clean it with a focus that was almost businesslike. All the panic gone now that they were loose. Gideon crouched beside the calf, checking it over with practiced hands. "She's all right," he said. Both of them?" Evelyn looked at the two of them in the hollow, the mother standing solid, the calf unsteady but present, the rope still in her hands. She exhaled a breath she'd been holding for several minutes. They got the cow moving with the calf tucked close, Gideon on one side and Evelyn on the other, guiding them down off the ridge and back across the open ground toward the barn. The snow was heavier now. The wind had gone from purposeful to brutal. By the time they made it through the barn doors and got the cow and calf into a deep-bedded stall, Evelyn's hands had stopped hurting from the cold and gone to something beyond pain. That was when she started to worry about them. Gideon saw her trying to flex her fingers and said nothing, but went immediately to the tack room and came back with a dry cloth and the heavy wool blanket stored there for exactly this kind of situation. He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and took her hands between his and rubbed, firm and deliberate, until the feeling came back in a rush of pins and fire. She didn't pull away. It hurt too much and helped too much at the same time. "Thank you," she said when she could feel her fingers again. He let go, stepped back all business. Elias had a fire going in the small shelter room off the barn, a low, stone-walled space with a wood stove that existed specifically for nights like this. They sat there, the three of them, listening to the storm work itself out against the barn walls while the horses shifted and the new calf made its first real sounds. The fire got the warmth back into the room gradually. Gideon sat with his forearms on his knees, looking at the stove. His coat was wet across the shoulders. The scar on his face caught the firelight in a way that made it more visible than usual, cutting down from his cheekbone to his jaw in that pale, uneven line. Evelyn had wondered about it since the first day. She'd never asked. She looked at it now and then looked at the fire. Gideon said, without being asked, "A commander I had. During the war, he wanted to burn a farmhouse to cut off a supply line. There was a family inside." He paused. "I wouldn't follow that order." Evelyn looked at him. "Another officer enforced it," he said. "I got in the way. That's where the scar came from." "Did the family get out?" "Yes." She looked at the scar again, at the pale, jagged line that had been his consequence for doing the right thing, when doing it cost something real. She reached across without thinking about it too carefully and touched it lightly with 2 fingers, just for a moment. "This isn't a mark of failure, Gideon," she said. "It's proof of a compassionate heart." He went very still. Not uncomfortable, just still, the way people go still when they've heard something true that they didn't know they needed to hear. He didn't respond right away. The storm pushed against the barn walls. The calf in the stall made another sound, steadier now, more confident. The fire popped once and settled. Then Gideon said quietly, "I've had people tell me it makes me look frightening." "Those people were wrong," Evelyn said. He looked at her. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Ironwood Ranch, the controlled reserve in his expression let something else through, not weakness, nothing like that. Just the unguarded look of a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and been understood unexpectedly by someone he hadn't planned on. Elias, who had been stirring the coals with perfect discretion, stood up and announced he was going to check on the calf and walked out of the shelter room without looking at either of them. Gideon almost smiled. Evelyn did. Outside, the storm was already beginning to spend itself. The wind dropped in intervals, testing its own exhaustion. In another hour it would be finished, and the world would be white and clean and quiet. Inside the shelter, the fire burned steady. They sat there a while longer without speaking, close enough that the warmth between them was difficult to separate from the warmth of the stove, and neither of them moved to make the distinction. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday, the way most trouble did in Otero Valley, quietly at first, and then all at once. It started with a rider. Evelyn was in the schoolhouse running a reading session with the older children when she heard hooves on the road. She didn't think much of it. Riders passed the ranch road regularly. She kept her finger under the line of text, and Raphael kept reading, slowly and with effort, and with the determination of someone who had decided that difficulty was not a reason to stop. But then she heard Elias's voice from the yard, and the tone of it was wrong. She told the children to keep reading to each other and went to the door. The rider was already gone. Elias stood in the yard holding a folded paper, and the expression on his face was the one he wore when he was making himself stay calm by force of will. He looked up when she came out. "Where's Gideon?" Evelyn asked. "North Range. Won't be back until late afternoon." "What is that?" He held the paper out. It came from town. Someone sent it, unofficial, through a boy, to warn us. She took it and read it. It was short. Someone, it didn't say who, had gone to the county records office in Socorro and pulled the public register of Genevieve Drake's name. A claim had been filed, not a legal charge, not yet, but a formal complaint brought to the circuit court clerk's office by a party unnamed in the document. The complaint referenced publications distributed in the state of Massachusetts between 1,872 and 1,879 deemed seditious by private interests who had ties, it turned out, to at least 2 men currently operating in the New Mexico territory. Jonas Sterling's name appeared nowhere in the document. It didn't need to. Evelyn read it twice. Then she folded it and stood very still in the yard for a moment thinking. Genevieve had spent 7 years operating a small press in Boston's South End. She'd printed suffragist literature, labor pamphlets, and toward the end, essays that named specific men in the textile and railroad industries by name and connected their business practices to the suppression of women's wages and the intimidation of union organizers. Those men had money, and those men had memory, and those men, it turned out, had associates who had come west to find new land and new power. Her mother had known this was possible. Evelyn understood that now. She'd understood it when Genevieve agreed to come west with her, that distance from Boston wasn't the same as safety, and that the things her mother had put into print couldn't be unprinted. She went inside and sat across from her mother at the table. Genevieve looked at her face and said, "Tell me?" Evelyn told her. Genevieve listened without interrupting. Her hands were flat on the table. When Evelyn finished, her mother was quiet for a long moment. "How long have they known where I am?" Genevieve asked. "The document was filed 6 days ago, so at least 6 days." Genevieve nodded slowly. She didn't look frightened. She looked tired in a way that went beyond the illness, the exhaustion of a woman who had fought the same battle in different rooms for 30 years and could recognize its next phase arriving. "Sterling found out," Evelyn said. "He's using it." "Of course he is." Genevieve looked out the window at the yard. A sick old woman with a sedition complaint in her file is a useful thing to have if you want to pressure the man who's sheltering her. She paused. "This isn't about me. I'm leverage." "It's about both," Evelyn said. Her mother looked back at her. "Will Gideon?" "Yes," Evelyn said before the question was finished. She said it without hesitation. And only after she'd said it did she realize how certain she was. "Yes, he will." Genevieve looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes. "All right," she said. 2 days passed. Gideon came home, was told, and his reaction was exactly what Evelyn had predicted, measured, direct, and immediate in its practical focus. He rode to town the next morning to speak with the circuit court clerk and came back with information. The complaint was real but thin. It would require a judge to act on it, and no circuit judge was due in the valley for 3 weeks. 3 weeks was time. It was also not much time. They used it. Gideon began speaking quietly with men he trusted, war veterans, longtime homesteaders, men who had their own reasons to distrust Sterling and his reach. Elias, whose reading had now reached the point where he could work through a legal document with effort and a dictionary, sat at the table with Gideon most evenings, going through land records and water rights filings, looking for inconsistencies in Sterling's claims. Genevieve kept printing her sheets. She printed them every day, more now than before, and the children took them home, and the homesteaders read them, and they talked. The schoolhouse kept meeting, and then came the morning. Gideon rode out before sunrise to the far northern fence line, 6 miles from the house. Evelyn was teaching. She had all 9 children by then. 2 more had joined from a homestead near the creek, and they were in the middle of a geography lesson, the children taking turns placing stones on a hand-drawn map of the territory, when she heard the horses. More than one, moving fast, then stopping. She looked out the schoolhouse window and felt the day change. There were 6 riders in the yard. Sheriff Aldous Crane was among them, a broad, careful man who Evelyn had met once in town and assessed as someone who operated by whatever arrangement kept him in his position. Sterling's man, without being formally Sterling's man. Beside him, 2 deputies she didn't recognize. Behind them, Sterling's hired hands, including the man with the square face whose wrist Gideon had bent back without breaking 3 weeks ago. And behind all of them, Jonas Sterling himself, on a dark horse, watching the proceedings with the detached patience of a man watching someone else do a task he's already paid for. Evelyn told Clara, who was 12 and the oldest of the children, to keep everyone inside and quiet. Then she walked out. She stepped onto the yard and stood in front of the porch steps and looked at the sheriff. "Miss Drake," Crane said. He held a folded document. "I need to speak with Genevieve Drake." "On what authority?" He held up the document. "Arrest warrant, signed by the territory clerk, pending circuit court review." "The circuit court judge hasn't arrived yet," Evelyn said. "A clerk's warrant is provisional and requires judicial confirmation before a lawful arrest can be made. Are you prepared to state in front of witnesses that this warrant has been judicially confirmed?" Crane paused. Sterling's horse shifted. Evelyn kept her voice clear and her feet planted. "Sheriff, I'm going to quote you the 4th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which guarantees the right of persons to be secure against unreasonable seizure, and I'm going to remind you that an unconfirmed provisional warrant does not satisfy the probable cause requirement for arrest. If you proceed without judicial confirmation, you are not enforcing the law. You are breaking it." She looked past Crane at the men behind him, at Sterling. "Every person in this yard is a witness to what procedure is being followed here," she said. "Every man here will be asked, in that circuit court, what they saw done and whether it was lawful." Crane looked uncomfortable. He glanced back at Sterling, which told Evelyn everything she needed to know about whose authority he was actually operating under. "We'll wait outside while you bring the woman out," Sterling said from the back. Smooth, impatient. "You'll wait," Evelyn said, "until a circuit judge confirms that warrant. That's the law. Not my preference. Not a negotiation. The law." From inside the house, she heard her mother cough. Short, controlled. From behind Sterling's group, one of the hired hands moved toward the schoolhouse. "Don't," Evelyn said sharply. The man stopped, looked at Sterling. Sterling nodded once. The man went to the schoolhouse and kicked open the door. The sound of children's voices spiked and then went quiet. Clara's voice came through clear. Everyone stayed together. The hired hand came out with an armload of books, the readers, the primers, the geography texts Evelyn had ordered from Santa Fe and paid for from her own money. He dropped them in the yard. Another man came with a lit torch. Evelyn's jaw set hard. "Those are children's books," she said. Nobody answered her. The books caught fast, paper always does. She stood and watched them burn, and kept her face even because she understood, in a cold and clarifying way, that this was exactly what Sterling wanted. He wanted her to break composure. He wanted a scene that could be retold later as something other than what it was. She did not give him that. She looked at Crane. I want the name of every man present recorded in the court documents. Will you confirm your name for the record, Sheriff? Crane opened his mouth. And then from up the ridge road came the heavy, frantic thunder of a horse running hard. Everyone in the yard heard it before they saw it. The ground picked it up first, a vibration, then a rhythm, then the clear sound of hooves on frozen road coming down fast from the north. Gideon's horse came around the bend at a full run, throwing clods of dirt from the road, and Gideon rode it the way men ride when something important is on fire behind them, and something worse is ahead of them, and stopping is not a consideration. He pulled up hard in the yard entrance, the horse sliding on the gravel, and took in the scene in about 2 seconds: the sheriff, the warrant, the smoke from the burning books. Sterling on his dark horse in the back, Evelyn standing alone on the porch in front of all of it. His eyes went to Evelyn first. She gave him the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. He understood it. She could see him understand it. The deliberate exhale. The hand that went to his gun and then stayed for now. For now, the yard was very quiet. Gideon dismounted in one motion and came through the yard entrance on foot. He walked past the burning books without looking at them, which cost him something. Evelyn could see it. Cost him something, and came to stand beside her on the porch steps. He was covered in trail dust, still breathing hard from the ride. The scar on his jaw was a tight line. He looked at Sheriff Crane. That warrant been confirmed by a judge? His voice was even. Not yet, Crane admitted. He at least had the decency to look like a man doing something he hadn't fully committed to. Then you're in my yard on no legal authority, Gideon said. Burning books that belonged to a schoolhouse full of children. Sterling urged his horse forward a few steps. Mercer, this is territorial law at work. I'd advise you not to. You'd advise me. Gideon looked at him flatly. A man who sends hired hands to intimidate a sick woman and set fire to children's books is going to advise me. Sterling's expression didn't change. You're protecting a seditious element. That makes you party to.
To what?
Gideon said. To sheltering a woman who published pamphlets. Is that the law you're applying today? Because I serve this country, Sterling. I watched men die for the right to say what they believed without being called criminal for it. Don't talk to me about sedition. He turned to Crane. Get your men off my property. Come back with a confirmed judicial warrant, and I'll cooperate fully with the law. Come back before that, and I'll file a complaint for unlawful entry and destruction of private property with that same circuit judge. Crane looked at Sterling again. Sterling looked at Gideon. Something moved in his eyes, not respect, not retreat, calculation. We'll be back, Sterling said. And he turned his horse. The other riders followed. Crane last, and slowly, the folded warrant still in his hand. When the last rider cleared the road, and the sound of hooves faded, the yard was completely silent. Then Clara appeared in the schoolhouse doorway, holding 3 younger children by their hands, her 12-year-old face set in an expression that was doing its level best to look unafraid and mostly succeeding. Are we all right? She asked. We're all right, Evelyn said. You did well, Clara, keeping everyone calm. Clara nodded once, very serious, and went back inside. Gideon stood looking at the smoldering pile of books in the yard. His fists were at his sides. He was holding something in, and Evelyn knew it, and she knew what it was, the same fury she felt. The same outrage at books burned in front of children as a message, as an act of intimidation designed to make everyone here feel small and unprotected. His hand moved toward his holster. Evelyn stepped forward and took his arm, not to restrain him, to reach him. Don't let them turn you into an outlaw, she said. We fight with truth and dignity. He looked at her. His hand stopped. She held his arm and looked up at his face and said it again, quieter. Just for him, we fight with truth and dignity. That's the only fight we can win, Gideon breathed. The tension in his arm held for one more moment, then released, not all at once but steadily. like a fist unclenching. He looked back at the smoldering books. Then at the schoolhouse door, where the sound of children's voices had started up again, Clara apparently having decided that the lesson could continue regardless. "She's teaching them," Gideon said, almost to himself. "Of course she is," Evelyn said. He looked at her. Something passed between them, not soft, nothing comfortable. They were standing in a yard with the smoke of burned books still in the air, with 6 miles of evidence that the law in this valley was crooked, and the man bending it had reach and patience. They were standing in the middle of a real fight, and Evelyn was still on her feet, still clear-eyed, still thinking. Gideon said, "I'll go to Elias. I'll come with you." They went inside. Elias was already at the table with the land record spread out and a look on his face that said he'd heard everything from the window and was 3 steps ahead. "Sterling's map," he said, without preamble, "the one he filed for the water rights boundary. I've been looking at it for 2 weeks, and something in the boundary markers doesn't match the survey records from 1876. He pushed the paper toward Gideon. "If his boundary map is forged or altered, then the entire water rights claim falls apart." Gideon sat down and looked at the map. Evelyn leaned over his shoulder and looked too. "We need proof," she said. "Not a suspicion. Actual evidence that holds in court." "Genevieve," Gideon said. Evelyn looked up. "Your mother ran a printing press for 30 years, he said. "She knows ink. She knows print. If that map was recently altered, or freshly printed, to look old, would she be able to tell?" Evelyn thought about this, about her mother's hands, those skilled, calloused hands that had run type since before Evelyn was born, about the fact that Genevieve had taught herself to identify paper stock and ink composition by feel and smell, because the press operators in Boston had charged different rates for different materials, and you learned to tell them apart, or you got cheated. "Yes," Evelyn said. She would be able to tell. She went to the back room and found her mother sitting up, the blanket over her lap, a piece of print type, turning slowly between her fingers. Genevieve looked up when Evelyn came in, and her expression sharpened immediately. "What do you need?" she asked. "Your eyes and your hands," Evelyn said. "On a forged map." Genevieve set the type down. "Bring it." They carried the land records to Genevieve's room and spread them across the bed. Genevieve put on her reading glasses, wire-rimmed, one arm repaired with thread, and bent over Sterling's boundary map with the focus of a woman performing surgery. She ran her fingertip along the ink at one of the boundary lines, bent closer, pressed 2 fingers flat against the surface of the paper near the corners. Nobody spoke. "After several minutes," she said, "the ink at the eastern boundary marker is different from the rest of the document." "How can you tell?" Elias asked. "The sheen," Genevieve said. "Older ink oxidizes, goes flat. This section here," she pointed to a 3-inch section of line near the eastern edge, "is still slightly reflective. It was printed or drawn recently, months ago at most. The rest of this document is years old." She straightened. "Someone took an old survey document and added to it, redrew this boundary line, or extended it. The paper is old. The ink in this section is not." Gideon looked at the line. "That's the section that crosses our water source," Elias said quietly. The room held that information for a moment. Then Gideon began speaking, and his voice had the focused, deliberate quality of a man making a plan rather than reacting to a situation. He laid it out clean: the circuit judge arriving in 3 weeks, the need for sworn witnesses, the land records that predated Sterling's version of the boundary, the men he'd spoken to who had their own complaints against Sterling and would testify. He asked Genevieve if she would testify to what she'd found in the ink. "Without hesitation," she said. He asked Elias to begin identifying veterans and homesteaders who would stand in that courtroom. "Already started," Elias said. He asked Evelyn what she could do in 3 weeks with the schoolhouse and the community of people who'd been coming through it. She thought about that, about Raphael's father and his unsigned papers, about Clara's family with no books, about the homesteaders who'd been reading Genevieve's printed sheets and finding their voices for grievances they'd held quietly for years. "I can make sure that courtroom isn't empty," she said. Gideon looked at her for a moment. "Good," he said. He stood up from the edge of the bed and looked at the three of them, Evelyn, Elias, Genevieve, in that small room with the land records spread out and the smell of smoke still faint on the air from outside. "Sterling burned books today," he said, in front of children, "because he thought it would frighten us into staying quiet." He paused. "He misjudged this house." Genevieve, from her pillow, said, "He misjudged all of us." Outside, the afternoon was going gold. In the schoolhouse, across the yard, Clara's voice drifted through the window, reading aloud to the younger children, from whatever book hadn't been in the pile they burned. It turned out she'd taken the geography text home the night before to show her mother. The fire had missed it entirely. The circuit courtroom in Socorro was not built for crowds. It was a single room above the assay office, with 12 bench seats, a judge's table at the front, and 2 narrow windows that let in more dust than light. By the morning of the hearing, it held nearly 40 people, and another dozen stood along the back wall, ranch hands into the stairwell. Homesteaders, veterans with sun-weathered faces and straight backs, Raphael's father holding his hat, Clara's mother, who had never been inside a government building in her life, and sat with her hands folded and her chin up. Elias, in the front row, with a folder of land records across his knees. Gideon sat at the respondents' table with the composure of a man who had waited in harder places than this. Evelyn sat beside him. Judge Harlan Foss arrived at 9 o'clock, precisely a lean, deliberate man from Albuquerque, with a reputation, Gideon had been told, for reading documents himself, rather than taking anyone's word for what they said. That mattered today. Sterling sat at the opposite table with his lawyer, a man from Santa Fe, in a coat that cost more than most people in the room made in a month. Sterling looked at the crowd once when he came in, and something crossed his face. Not worry, not yet, but the first awareness that the room was not arranged in his favor. The lawyer presented Sterling's water rights claim first. He laid the boundary map on the judge's table with the confidence of someone who expected the document to speak for itself. Judge Foss looked at it for a long time. Then Sterling's lawyer began his argument, and it was polished and detailed and built on the assumption that no one in the room could contradict the map's authority. He spoke about property rights, territorial development, the public good of managed water access. He spoke for 20 minutes. When he finished, Judge Foss looked at Gideon's side of the table. Evelyn stood. She presented the 1,876 survey records, first the originals, pulled from the county archive by Elias, 3 days after the hearing was announced. She walked the judge through the boundary lines as recorded before Sterling had ever set foot in Otero Valley. Clear, precise, and inconsistent with the map. Sterling's lawyer had just submitted. Then she called Genevieve. Genevieve walked to the front of the room with a steadiness that the past weeks of rest had given back to her, at least partially. She carried a small leather case. She set it on the edge of the judge's table and opened it, the magnifying glass she'd used at the Boston press for fine inspection work. A small vial of the solvent she'd brought from her kit, 2 cotton cloths. She picked up Sterling's boundary map. Sterling's lawyer was on his feet immediately. Objection. The witness is handling an evidentiary document without... She's examining it, Judge Foss said. Sit down. Genevieve ran the magnifying glass along the eastern boundary line with the focused patience of someone who had done precision work for 40 years. She set the glass down and pressed one cloth lightly against the ink in the contested section, held it, lifted it. A faint transfer, barely visible, but visible. She held the cloth up so the judge could see. The ink at the eastern boundary marker is not the same age as the rest of this document, Genevieve said. Her voice was clear and steady and carried to the back of the room without effort. Older oxidizes and bonds fully to the paper. This section is still reactive. The transfer on this cloth confirms it. She set the cloth on the table beside the map. This line was drawn months ago. The rest of this survey is years old. Someone added to this document after the fact. The room was very quiet. Sterling's lawyer said something sharp and procedural. Judge Foss held up one hand, and the lawyer stopped. The judge picked up the magnifying glass himself and looked at the map. Then he looked at the cloth. Then he set both down and looked at Sterling with an expression that was entirely neutral, and therefore, Evelyn thought, more frightening than anger would have been. Sterling said nothing. Evelyn stood. She looked at the crowd before she looked at the judge, at Clara's mother and Raphael's father, and the veterans along the walls, and Elias in the front row, with his folder of documents, the man who had set his own name in type 4 months ago, and could now read a land contract without flinching. She looked at all of them, and then she spoke. The soul of the American West wasn't built on the strong crushing the weak, she said. It was built on neighbors protecting the vulnerable, on communities deciding that a person's worth isn't measured by what they own or who they know, but by the simple fact of their humanity. She paused. What's been done in this valley, the intimidation, the forged documents, the burning of children's books, isn't strength. It's fear. It's what power looks like when it knows it can't win on honest ground. She set her hands flat on the table. We're asking this court to see clearly what's in front of it. The evidence is there. The law is there. We trust this court to do what it exists to do. She sat. The benches erupted. Not chaos, something more deliberate than that. The veterans struck their palms against the wood in a rhythm, and the homesteaders joined them. And the sound filled the small room above the assay office and went out through the narrow windows into the street below. Judge Foss let it go for 5 seconds. Then he struck his gavel once, and the room settled. He looked at the map, at the cloth, at the survey records from 1876. He ruled at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Genevieve was exonerated. The complaint against her, lacking any credible legal foundation, independent of Sterling's influence, was dismissed entirely. Sterling's water rights claim, based on the falsified boundary map, was declared void. His land licenses in Otero Valley, 3 of which were found to have relied on similar documentation methods, were revoked pending review. Sterling left without speaking. His lawyer gathered the papers and followed him out. In the courtroom, people shook hands and embraced and spoke in 3 languages at once, and Elias stood in the middle of it with his folder of documents under his arm and the quiet, grounded expression of a man who had contributed to justice being done and knew it. Genevieve sat in her chair near the judge's table and breathed. Evelyn crouched beside her. "Are you all right?" "Better than I've been in years," her mother said. They rebuilt the schoolhouse in 10 days. Not just Gideon and Elias. Raphael's father came with 2 of his brothers. The veterans who had stood along the courtroom walls showed up with tools. Clarice's family brought lumber from their own claim. The homesteader women came with food and stayed to help with the smaller work, the shelves, the window frames, the bench seats planed smoother this time than before. By the end of the 10 days, the new schoolhouse was sturdier, larger, and better lit than the old one. It had 2 real windows with shutters, a proper wooden floor instead of packed earth, and a shelf long enough to hold twice the books. The first morning it opened, 14 children came. Clara arrived first, as she always did, and hung her coat on the new peg inside the door, and sat in what had become her seat in the front row, where she'd moved herself after the hearing, without comment and without fanfare, as if this was simply where she belonged now. Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at the full benches and the new chalkboard and the shelf that Elias had installed, correctly level, on the first try, and allowed herself one long quiet moment to feel what she felt. Then she called the class to order. Peace returned to Ironwood Ranch, in the way real peace usually does not with an announcement, but with a gradual absence of tension. Mornings that started without dread. Evenings at the table where conversation ran long because there was no reason to cut it short. Gideon slept through most nights now. Evelyn knew because she did too. Genevieve was writing again. Not pamphlets this time, a newspaper. 4 pages, hand-set, printed twice weekly on the press she'd brought from Boston and maintained through every mile of the journey west. She called it the Ironwood Register, and she printed it with the same care she'd given to the suffragist sheets in Boston, and she delivered it through Elias to every homestead within riding distance. It covered local matters, water policy, school attendance records, seed prices, and livestock news, and occasionally a short editorial in Genevieve's precise voice on the subject of working people's rights, which people read at their kitchen tables and passed to their neighbors. Her health was better. It wasn't fixed. The lung illness didn't fix, it only managed. But the rest, and the clean desert air, and the purpose that had come back into her daily hours, had steadied something that had been unsteadying for 2 years. One evening, about 3 weeks after the trial, Gideon came to find Evelyn as she was closing up the schoolhouse for the night. "Will you come somewhere with me?" he asked. She looked at him. "Where?" "The overlook. There's still an hour of light." She pulled her coat from the hook and went with him. The overlook was a granite shelf at the top of the South Ridge, a 30-minute ride from the ranch that faced west over the whole spread of Otero Valley. Evelyn had heard Elias mention it, but hadn't been there. When they reached it and she looked out, she understood immediately why it had a name. The valley stretched out below in every direction, wide and ancient, the red rock going amber and gold in the late light, the Rio Grande, a distant silver thread, the sky above it, enormous and turning colors she didn't have precise names for. They stood there for a moment without speaking. Then Gideon turned to her. He reached into the pocket of his coat and brought out a ring. Small, plain, forged from brass that had been worked smooth. She looked at it, and then at him, and he went down on one knee on the granite shelf with the valley behind him and the last of the sun on his face. "I'm not asking for a wife to serve this house," he said. His voice was steady and quiet and entirely serious. "I'm asking for an equal partner to walk through every storm with me." Evelyn looked at him, at the scar on his jaw and the dark, honest eyes and the calloused hands that had picked up her bag at a depot without being asked, and handed her mother a canteen without ceremony, and held her frozen hands by a barn fire, and never once asked her to be less than she was. Her eyes filled. She let them. "Yes," she said. He stood and put the ring on her finger, brass warm from his pocket. She looked at it in the last of the light. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "A military medal," he said. "I didn't need it for anything else." She looked up at him. Then she stepped in and rested her forehead against his jaw, and he put his arms around her, and they stood on the overlook while the valley went from gold to amber to the long blue of early dusk. 5 years later, the ranch looked like something that had decided what it wanted to be. The schoolhouse had been extended twice. It had 4 windows now, and a real door with iron hinges Elias had made himself. And on the shelf along the east wall there were books in English, Spanish, and 2 texts in the Navajo language that Evelyn had ordered from a printer in Albuquerque after 3 children from a family, settled near the northern ridge, began attending the previous spring. On any given morning, the benches held white children, and black children, and Mexican children, and native children sitting together in the uncomplicated way that children sit together when no one has yet taught them reasons not to. Clara was 17 now. She helped Evelyn with the younger students on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and she read with a confidence and fluency that made it hard to picture the 9-year-old who had appeared in the back row with no explanation 5 years before, watching everything with fierce, hungry eyes. She was going to be a teacher. She'd told Evelyn so plainly 2 winters ago, and Evelyn had said, equally plainly, that she would help her get there. She meant it. Elias managed the ranch accounts, the legal filings, and the community correspondence, and he did it all without assistance. And the people who had once looked past him in town had made their adjustments or found that the valley had no particular patience for that kind of thing anymore. He'd taken on 2 apprentices from neighboring spreads, young men who wanted to learn figures and law, and he taught them the way Evelyn had taught him, directly, without softening the work or the expectation. The Ironwood Register was in its 5th year of publication. Genevieve had outlasted every prediction the illness had made about her, partly through stubbornness, and partly through the fact that she had too much left to print. The paper had subscribers now in 3 counties. It had run articles that prompted 2 territorial policy reviews and 1 formal response from a Socorro alderman who had clearly not enjoyed reading his name in print attached to a specific voting record. Genevieve had framed that letter and hung it above the press. On an evening in late September, with the harvest done and the air gone cool and sharp, Gideon and Evelyn stood on the porch of the main house and watched the sun drop behind the Ironwood Ridge. Their son was asleep inside. 2 years old, with Evelyn's determination already visible in the set of his jaw, and, everyone agreed, Gideon's talent for appearing somewhere before you'd heard him coming. The valley below was going quiet and golden. Gideon said, "I've been thinking about the day you arrived." Evelyn looked at him. "The depot," he said. "Sterling standing there telling you to leave your mother behind." She waited. "A man who lets a woman abandon her mother," Gideon said, "is a man who would easily abandon his vows to her." He paused. I don't think Sterling ever understood that. He thought he was talking about property, about what was practical. He shook his head. He wasn't. He was showing everyone in that yard exactly who he was. Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder. "And you said, 'Bring her home,'" she said. "I've thought about that a lot, that it wasn't just a roof you were offering." She looked out at the valley. It was a position, a belief about what people owe each other. "That's all it ever was," Gideon said. The light was going long and amber across the range. From inside the house, they could hear Genevieve's voice, low and even, reading aloud to her grandson one of the short stories she printed on the press and kept a stack of on the shelf by the rocking chair. The child couldn't understand the words yet, but he listened, held by the rhythm and the warmth of the voice. Evelyn said, "When I got off that coach, I thought I was being practical. I thought I'd come to a reasonable arrangement in a manageable situation." "Were you frightened?" Gideon asked. "Thoroughly," she said. "I just refused to let it show." He looked at her, and the expression in his face was the same one that had been there since the beginning, clear, steady, direct, but with 5 years of everything they'd built together sitting behind it. "And you said, 'Bring her home,'" Evelyn said again, quieter. "That wasn't just a house, Gideon." She looked up at him. That was humanity. He took her hand. They stood on the porch while the light finished its work on the valley, while the ridge went from amber to purple, to the first deep blue of evening, while the Ironwood Register sat folded on the table, inside waiting for morning delivery, while 14 children's names were written in Evelyn's ledger for tomorrow's lessons, while the press sat ready in Genevieve's room, while the brass ring on Evelyn's hand caught the last sliver of sun and held it a moment before letting it go. The cottonwoods moved in the early evening wind. The ranch was quiet. The day was done. And that's where we leave them. Gideon and Evelyn, standing on the porch of Ironwood Ranch, watching the sun go down over the valley they built together. Not a perfect life, but an honest one. And in 1,881 New Mexico, in a world that measured people by what they owned and what they could produce, an honest life was the most radical thing 2 people could choose. So what does this story actually give us? What do we take home from Otero Valley? The first thing is this: human dignity is not conditional. Sterling looked at Genevieve Drake, a sick, aging woman with no money and no power, and saw a liability, a cost, something to be managed or discarded. And he genuinely believed that was a reasonable way to see another person. That is not a villain from 1,881. That is a way of thinking that is still alive and still doing damage today. Every time we measure someone's worth by their productivity, their health, their usefulness to us in this particular moment, we are doing exactly what Sterling did in that depot. Evelyn refused it out loud, in public, with witnesses. She named it for what it was, and Gideon refused it in the simplest possible way. He just picked up the bag and made room. Sometimes that's all dignity requires. Just make room. The second thing this story teaches us is about the power of literacy and education, not as abstract ideals, but as practical tools of survival. Elias Quick was a man of extraordinary intelligence. He managed accounts, ran a ranch, navigated a legal and social system that was actively hostile to him, and did it all while being unable to read a full letter from start to finish. That gap between what he knew and what he couldn't access was a weapon in other people's hands. The moment Evelyn sat down across from him and said, "Would you want to learn?" And the moment Genevieve set his name in brass type and said, "Now, you put it together yourself," they weren't being charitable. They were closing a gap that power had deliberately created. Education is never just about school. It's about who gets to participate in their own life on equal terms. Elias spent years doing everything right and still being vulnerable because he couldn't read the contract. By the end of this story, he's teaching others. That's not a small thing. That's how communities change. The third lesson, and maybe the quietest one, is about what healing actually looks like. Gideon Mercer carried the war with him for years, not loudly, not dramatically, just in the boots on the floor before dawn, the door opening and closing, the particular stillness at the supper table that was less like calm and more like held breath. What healed him wasn't a single conversation or a single moment. It was the accumulation of a house full of purpose children's voices in the schoolhouse yard, Elias reading a full sentence without stopping, his mother-in-law printing the news, Evelyn still teaching even after her books had been burned in front of her. Purpose heals in a way that nothing else quite does. And being truly seen by another person, the way Evelyn saw the scar on his jaw, not as something frightening, but as evidence of a compassionate heart that reaches places that time alone cannot. And then there is the title. The thing Sterling said at the depot, the thing that set everything in motion. He told her to abandon her mother, as if that were reasonable. As if a woman who could make that choice was the kind of woman worth having. Gideon understood something Sterling never did. A person's character is not revealed in the easy moments. It's revealed in exactly that moment when abandoning someone is the practical choice, the logical choice, the choice that makes your own life simpler. What Evelyn did at that depot, standing her ground with a sick mother on her arm and no guarantee that anyone would back her up, told Gideon everything he needed to know about who she was. And what he said in response, 4 words, no ceremony, no negotiation, told her everything she needed to know about him. My home has room. That sentence is the whole story. That sentence is the whole argument. We are defined not by what we do when it's easy, but by what we make room for when it costs us something. That's the story. That's what we came here for. This story is a work of historical fiction. All characters, events, and dialogue are fictional and created for entertainment and